homicides were up by 100% in Minneapolis, 200% in Seattle, 40% in St. Louis, 240% in Atlanta, and 182% in Chicago. In New York City, shootings have more than doubled so far in 2020 compared with last year. In June, 97% of New York shooting victims were people of color. Since George Floyd's death, at least 35 children under the age of 18 have been fatally shot, nearly all black. We have been here before. In 2015 and 2016, homicides in the U.S. saw their largest increase in nearly 50 years, following the police shooting death of Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri, in August 2014. Brown's death fueled the first iteration of the Black Lives Matter movement. Cops backed off from proactive policing, having been relentlessly told that they were racist, for example, to question someone hanging out on a known drug corner at 1 a.m., hitching up his waistband as if he had a gun. As a result of this decline in discretionary enforcement, another 2,000 blacks lost their lives in 2015 and 2016 compared to 2014 numbers. The rapid rise of crime over the last 2 months makes that first version of what I've called the Ferguson effect look like child's play. Every year, the police fatally shoot about 1,000 people, the vast majority of whom are threatening the officer or bystanders with deadly force. About 50% of those police fatalities are white, and about 25% are black. The Black Lives Matter folks look at that 25% number and proclaim police bias, since blacks are about 13% of the population. That is the wrong benchmark, however. If there is one thing you should take away from today's discussion, it is that police activity must be measured against crime, not population ratios. Every article you read, every news story you watch in the mainstream media will compare police activity to a population benchmark, because that is the only way that the Black Lives Matter narrative can be sustained. Such an analysis ignores the fact that policing today is data-driven. Officers are deployed to where people are most being victimized, and that is in minority neighborhoods. And it is in minority neighborhoods where officers are most likely to interact with armed, violent, and resisting suspects. Here are the victimization data. Nationwide, blacks between the ages of 10 and 43 die of homicide at 13 times the rate of whites, according to the CDC. In Minnesota, blacks of all ages die of homicide at 12 times the rate of whites. You might think that the Black Lives Matter activists would care about such loss of black life, but you would be wrong. They ignore those black deaths because the victims are killed overwhelmingly not by the police, not by whites, but by other blacks. Here are the criminal offending data. In the 75 largest U.S. counties, which is where most of the population resides, blacks constitute around 60% of all murder and robbery defendants, according to the Bureau of Justice Statistics, though they are only 15% of the population in those counties. Nationwide, blacks commit homicide at 8 times the rate of whites and Hispanics combined. In Chicago, blacks commit about 80% of all shootings and homicides, though they are less than a third of the population. Whites commit about 2% of all shootings and homicides in Chicago, though they too are less than a third of the population. In a typical year, blacks in St. Louis commit all or nearly all homicides, though they are less than half of the population. In New York City, blacks commit a little less than 75% of all shootings on average, though they are 23% of the city's population. Whites commit less than 3% of all shootings in New York City, though they are less than 34% though they are 34% of the city's population. These crime disparities have enormous consequences for police use of force. The biggest determinant of officer behavior is civilian behavior. The greater the chance that officers confront armed and resisting suspects, the more likely they are to escalate their own use of force. And that chance is far higher in black communities. As we will see, blacks are actually shot less by the police than their crime weights would predict, and whites are shot more. The percentage of white and Hispanic homicide victims who are killed by a cop is 3 times higher than the percentage of black homicide victims who are killed by a cop. So that 25% or so share of fatal police shootings each year comprised of black victims, when measured against a crime benchmark, does not support the Black Lives Matter narrative. What about the individual case? Mr. Floyd's death was immediately portrayed as what is known in literary theory as a synecdoche, a part that stands in for a whole, in this case, the whole of anti-Black police violence. But if we conclude from that one case, however shocking, that the police are biased against Black men, we could just as easily conclude from other individual cases that the police are biased against white men. Take the death of Tony Timpa, which adumbrated the death of Mr. Floyd. In 2016, the 32-year-old schizophrenic called 911 in Dallas to report that he was off his medication, frightened, and needed help. 3 Dallas police officers responded and kept Timpa face down on the ground for 13 minutes with a knee to his back, all the while joking about Timpa's mental illness. Timpa was handcuffed and had not resisted or threatened the officers. He pleaded for help more than 30 times, exclaiming that the cops were killing him. Eventually, Timpa stopped moving or making any sound as the officers continued their wisecracks. After Timpa was loaded into an ambulance, an officer said, "I hope I didn't kill him." Timpa was already dead from homicide caused by physical restraint and cocaine. Very few Americans outside of Timpa's family know his name. His death did not make international news or spur widespread riots. Because Timpa was white, his death did not fit the Black Lives Matter narrative, and thus was of no interest to the media. That same year, a cop in Mesa, Arizona, unleashed a barrage of gunfire from his AR-15 rifle at a 26-year-old man in a motel who had been reported as having a gun. The victim was down on his hands and knees in the corridor outside his motel room, trying to comply with the conflicting demands that the sergeant was screaming at him and begging, "Please don't shoot me." Like Timpa, the victim, Daniel Shaver, was white. In 2015, the year that the Black Lives Matter movement became a national phenomenon, a 50-year-old white man in Tuscaloosa involved in a domestic violence incident ran at the officer with a spoon and was fatally shot. A white 25-year-old male in Des Moines led the police on a car chase and walked quickly towards the officer when he got out of the car and was fatally shot. A white 21-year-old male in Akron escaped from a grocery store robbery on a bike and didn't take his hand out of his waistband when commanded to do so and was fatally shot. None of these victims were armed. No one knows these men's names either because they don't help the narrative. Had any of these victims been Black, however, there is a good chance that they too would have become international cause célèbres. The widespread perception that questionable police shootings occur exclusively or almost exclusively against Black males is a function of selective coverage. Let's look more closely at unarmed victims of fatal police shootings. According to the Washington Post database of fatal police shootings, there were 9 unarmed Black victims of fatal police shootings in 2019 and 19 unarmed white victims of fatal police shootings. The Washington Post defines unarmed generously to include suspects beating an officer with his own gun or fleeing a car stop with a loaded semi-automatic pistol in their car. Those 9 allegedly unarmed Black victims of fatal police shootings make up 0.1% of all Black homicide victims, assuming that the 2019 Black homicide count resembles that of 2018, when 7,400 Blacks were killed, more than all white and Hispanic homicide victims combined. 0.1% is not a large percentage, to say the least. After I publicized the 2019 tally of unarmed Black victims in early June, the Washington Post went back into its database to recategorize as unarmed as many armed Black victims of fatal police shootings as it possibly could. No new information spurred this reclassification. The database had been closed for 6 months. Despite its best efforts, the Post came up with only 6 more Black victims previously deemed armed, now miraculously disarmed, to bring the total of unarmed Black police victims in 2019 up to 15. That 15 represents 0.2% of all Black homicide victims, still a drop in the bucket. So individual cases, including unarmed cases, do not support the Black Lives Matter narrative. The claim that the death of George Floyd was the result of racism rather than bad tactics and a generalized callousness is pure supposition with no supporting evidence. But remember our rule: avoid population benchmarks when analyzing police activity. Crime is the proper benchmark, as the authors of the 2018 and now retracted 2019 studies well understand. When you compare fatal police shootings to homicide reports and arrests, the likelihood of being shot, in the author's words, quote, flips completely. Whites are about 3 times more likely to be fatally shot than blacks once their homicide rates are taken into account. There is also no evidence of bias in fatal police shootings when benchmarked against overall violent crime rates. Other studies have reached the same conclusion. Harvard economist Roland Fryer has found no racial discrimination in police shootings. Officers in 10 large cities and counties were more likely to shoot a suspect without first being attacked if the suspect was white than if the suspect was black. An analysis by the Center for Policing Equity also concluded that whites were disadvantaged compared to blacks when it comes to lethal force. An economist at Maryland's Pacific Institute for Research and Evaluation concluded that if blacks are killed by police officers at a rate higher than their population numbers, it's because of blacks' higher rate of arrest, not their skin color. Again, a question of the benchmark. A 2005 paper by criminologists at the California State University randomly sampled 400 police reports from a Southern California department. That includes 200 cases where the suspect resisted and 200 where the suspect complied. It found that resistance was more likely in high crime areas, and is the inevitable corollary of this fact that black suspects were more likely to resist arrest than white suspects. In fact, race was one of the most significant predictors of resistance, with black suspects being 4 times as likely to resist than whites. This finding accords with studies from 1995 and 2001 that officers who come into contact with non-white suspects are assaulted at a higher rate, and that most assaults on officers occur by suspects with criminal histories. Given the lack of racial disparities in police shootings, those who argue that officers use non-lethal force disproportionately against blacks have the burden of showing that any disparities in non-lethal force are not the product of suspect resistance. Proponents of the bias thesis have not met that burden. With the current tidal wave of hatred crashing down upon the police, further delegitimating their authority, suspect resistance will go up. That resistance will increase the chance of officer use of force, which, if videotaped and stripped of the civilian behavior that preceded it, will trigger new waves of civil violence. Let's briefly review car stops, another enduring topic in the case against cops. Studies claiming bias in traffic stops, as usual, use the wrong benchmark, population. The relevant benchmark is the rate at which different groups break traffic and equipment laws. There was a short period in the early 2000s when a criminologist could still study such matters and keep his job, but that window quickly closed. Before it did, New Jersey and North Carolina speeding studies showed that blacks speed more. On the New Jersey Turnpike, for example, at twice the rate of whites, a disparity that increases over 90 miles an hour. Any black cop will tell you that if he stops a black driver, the first thing out of the driver's mouth is, "You only stopped me because I'm black." The cop will respond, "No, I stopped you because you ran that red light or were driving 25 miles over the speed limit." I cannot comment on Senator Tim Scott's much circulated claims that he has been groundlessly stopped while driving. To do so, I would need to know the facts about each stop. We can stipulate, however, that law-abiding black men are more likely than law-abiding white men to be stopped and questioned at some point in their lives because they meet a suspect description. That higher chance of being stopped is a result of the fact that 1/3 of all black men have been convicted of a felony. With that larger proportion of criminal offenders in the broader population, the chances are higher that an innocent black male will share some characteristic, make of car, say, or physical traits with a suspect who is being sought by the police. That is a crime tax paid uniquely and tragically by law-abiding blacks. The solution to it is not to demonize the police. It is to lower black crime rates.